They had been sitting in the ditch for so long that their legs had gone numb. The air was cool, with that thin, brittle chill of an early spring morning. Damp grass pressed through their stockings, knees drawn up, backs against the low embankment. They tried not to shiver, because shivering made their teeth knock together, and the sound carried. They were not civilians. They were soldiers, of a sort. Field gray skirts instead of trousers, soft service caps instead of steel helmets. The last of their equipment, maps, signal books, field telephones, typewriter cases, lay piled on the road where American soldiers had tossed it an hour before. Most of them were in their late teens or early 20s. A few older, with lines already forming around the mouth. Their hair was pinned up in tight buns, still carefully arranged from habit, though no one had a mirror anymore. They knew, or believed they knew, what happened to women captured by the enemy. They had heard it whispered in barracks and in air raid shelters. They had read it between the lines in newspapers that never used plain words, but hinted darkly. They had watched the way older women, mothers and aunts, fell silent whenever the front line drew nearer on the map. Now they sat disarmed, separated from the men, at the side of a German country road under American guard. There was nowhere to run, and nothing left to bargain with. A truck backfired somewhere down the column. One of the women flinched and pulled her knees tighter to her chest. She wondered if this was the place it would finally happen. By the last months of the war, there were hundreds of thousands of women in Germany wearing some form of uniform. They served as clerks, telephone operators, radar watchers, drivers, nurses, and anti-aircraft auxiliaries. The German military called them Helferinnen, female helpers, for the Army, Air Force, and Navy. The SS had its own auxiliaries, especially at camps and headquarters. These women had not stormed beaches or taken cities. Their war was waged in offices and bunkers, at switchboards and map tables, in flak towers reading instruments in the dark. Many had been recruited directly from girls' schools. Some had volunteered out of conviction. Others signed up when conscription reached them, the war economy pulling everyone into its machinery. They wore the same field gray cloth as the men, but cut differently. Skirts instead of trousers, sometimes with sensible low-heeled shoes. Rank insignia on their cuffs or shoulder straps. A few carried sidearms when their job required it, but most had never fired a shot in anger. They knew they were part of the armed forces. They also knew that in the eyes of the enemy, that might not matter. By 1945, some German women in uniform, to the east especially, in SS service, had seen or taken part in acts that guaranteed rough treatment if caught. Others had simply typed orders and passed messages, never leaving their barracks except during air raids. Yet the uniform was a kind of label, and they all wore it. For years they had been told what to expect if the enemy ever reached German soil. The official propaganda was uneven. Toward the Western Allies, it alternated between contempt and warning. Toward the Soviets, it was blunt and terrifying. Newspapers and newsreels spoke of Bolshevik beasts, of atrocities in the East. Pamphlets circulated in some units with lurid stories. Some of these accounts were exaggerated, others were not. Rumors grew in the telling, passed from town to town with each wave of refugees. Older women remembered the stories from 1914, from 1918, stories of French colonial troops on the Rhine, of dishonor and shame. Those memories, half remembered and colored by 2 decades of politics, were now mixed with fresh tales from the collapsing Eastern Front. It did not help that some of the women had seen how their own side treated captured enemies, especially Soviet prisoners. They had seen columns of them marched through towns, thin and guarded by men with rifles held very loosely. They had heard what could happen to women in partisan territory and what Germans did in return. People assume the worst from others when they know what their own side has done. As the war turned against Germany, the picture darkened. By early 1945, Allied bombers were overhead almost daily. Refugees streamed westward with carts and baby carriages, crowding the roads. Every disaster brought new stories: shootings, looting, assaults, some real, some imagined, all blending together. Few of the women in the ditch could separate rumor from fact. They did not know that the American Army had issued strict regulations on the treatment of prisoners. They did not know that officers had been lectured on the Geneva Convention, or that U.S. commanders worried about how their own captured soldiers might be treated in return. They only knew what they had been warned about. So when the Americans separated them from the German men and marched them to another part of the field, many took this as the beginning of something much worse. The place itself was unremarkable. A narrow country road somewhere in southern Germany, April 1945. On one side, a plowed field not yet green. On the other, a strip of grass, a drainage ditch, then a small orchard behind a line of wire fencing that sagged in places. The fighting had moved past here only a day or two before. There were shell craters in the fields, but the trees still stood. A burned-out German vehicle smoldered by the roadside, its tires melted into black puddles. This was one of dozens of improvised collection points that sprung up behind the American advance. Frontline units did not have the time or space to manage growing numbers of prisoners, so they gathered them in open fields or wide verges under guard and waited for military police and transport. That morning, a mixed column of surrendering German troops had come down the road: older Volkssturm men in armbands, regular army soldiers without heavy weapons, wounded on makeshift carts, and a cluster of women in auxiliary uniforms clinging together in the middle of the column. American infantry had halted them at a crossroads. There had been a brief tense moment when one German officer hesitated, then tossed his pistol into the ditch and lifted his hands. After that, everything moved quickly. Orders were shouted in English, then repeated with a few words of broken German or French. Waffen weg! Hände hoch! Weapons away, hands up. The Americans had done this many times by now. Rifles, carbines, and machine pistols were piled separately in the ditch. Bayonets, ammo pouches, even field glasses were taken. Pockets were patted down for pistols and grenades. When the first American soldier reached the cluster of women, he slowed. They were already standing with their hands raised shoulder high, fingers spread, eyes fixed on him, a few with lips pressed so tight the color had gone out of them. He pointed to the side of the road. Frauen dort, women, there, he said, searching his memory for words his German-American parents had used at home. Damen, dort, ladies over there. They did not move at first. Then one of them, older, with a corporal's stripe on her sleeve, gave a quick jerk of her chin, and they stepped out of the column, up onto the grassy verge. To them, the separation felt ominous. The search for weapons came next. The Americans worked methodically. They had been surprised before by hidden pistols, even by grenades tucked into boots. The orders were clear: disarm everyone, no exceptions. One young American bent to take a leather satchel from a German woman's shoulder. It was heavy. It could have held a pistol or papers. He reached for the strap. She recoiled as if he had slapped her. "Nicht anfassen," she blurted out, voice sharp with panic. "Don't touch me." Her hands were still raised, but her body twisted away. The movement made the GI step back instinctively. He looked startled, then annoyed. The nearest military police sergeant, a stocky man with an MP band on his arm, turned at the sound. He walked over, boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. "What's the problem?" he asked. "She doesn't want me to take the bag, Sarge," the younger man said. "Yelled something. The sergeant studied the woman. Her chest was heaving. The strap of the satchel cut into her uniform where it had snagged under her arm. She was not much older than his kid sister back home. He held out his hand, palm open, and spoke in slow, careful German. "Tasche, here," he said quietly. "Bag, here." Keine Angst, no fear. He did not touch her. He simply waited, hand still extended, eyes fixed not on her body but on the satchel. For several long seconds, nothing moved. The other women watched, lips parted, waiting for the first blow, the first shove. Then, with a small, jerky motion, she slid the strap from her shoulder and placed the leather bag in his hand. The sergeant nodded once, almost formally. "Danke," he said. Thank you. He handed the bag to his private. Check it, don't dump it, he added. Just see what's inside. The tension in the group of women eased by a fraction. They were still wary. They stood stiffly as the Americans patted down their coats, but the searches were quick, businesslike, limited. The men checked belts, pockets, boots. They did not run hands where they didn't have to. They cared whether the women had weapons, not whether they felt embarrassment. To the Americans, this was routine. To the women, it contradicted years of fear. As the hours passed, the roadside collection point took on a kind of uneasy order. The German men sat together farther down the field, a broad strip of brown overcoats and gray uniforms under guard. The women remained in their smaller group near the ditch and the fence line. The Americans kept them separate deliberately. Part of it was practical. The women needed different arrangements for basic needs, and the army, though not always prepared, understood enough to try. Part of it was protective. In mixed groups of prisoners, tempers could flare. Collaborators, regime loyalists, wounded pride, and frayed nerves made for dangerous combinations. Women in the middle of that might become targets, not from the enemy, but from their own side. So the military police formed a loose perimeter around the women's section. They walked back and forth, checking that no one from the main male group drifted over. When one German soldier tried to approach, perhaps to deliver a message or share a blanket, an MP stopped him with an upraised hand and a terse, "Zurück," back. The German looked from the American to the women and retreated without argument. The women noticed this. They had braced for assault from outside. They had not anticipated being shielded from their own. Small details began to stand out. An American private walked the line with a battered metal canteen, pouring water into upturned mess cups and helmets. When he reached the women, his hand hesitated for a second. Then he went on distributing water as before, careful not to spill. One of the women, throat parched from hours of silence, gulped too quickly and coughed. The water went down the wrong way. She doubled over, choking. The private instinctively reached out a hand, then caught himself and pulled back, unsure. After an awkward pause, he gave her a moment, then offered the canteen again, this time holding it so she could grip the bottom without touching his fingers. Later, a jeep pulled up with a cardboard box of K-rations. The sergeant tore it open and tossed the small packages to the guards, who then passed them on to the prisoners. The German women turned the unfamiliar boxes over in their hands, decoding the English words: cheese and bacon, biscuits, candy. Inside, each found a few hard biscuits, a tin, a chocolate bar, some powdered drink, a piece of chewing gum. The chocolate startled them most. They had seen plenty of food in the hands of Allied airmen dropping bombs in the form of strength and endless fuel. They had not expected to be given something so scarce in their own homes. A woman whose stomach ached from hunger held the bar between her fingers and watched as the American guard mimed breaking and eating. She did so slowly, tasting, almost suspicious. The chocolate was sweet and a little stale. Whatever else the Americans were, they were not starving them. When one of the women asked in halting English to be allowed to relieve herself, there was another awkward moment. "Latrine?" she asked, cheeks flushing. The MP sergeant frowned, then nodded. "Chat, toilette," he said, searching for the right words. He gestured to his men and walked a few paces toward the orchard. He pointed to the gap in the fence where some of the wire had come loose. "You, 2, 3, he said, counting off a small group. "Go there." He tapped his watch. 5 Minuten. 5 minutes. He motioned 2 guards to stand facing away from the gap in the fence, rifles slung, backs turned. The women watched as the Americans deliberately averted their eyes. This small act of arranged privacy in the middle of captivity felt unexpectedly generous. In the afternoon, a light rain began to fall. It was not heavy enough to drive anyone for cover, but it seeped into cloth and chilled the skin. The prisoners hunched into their thin greatcoats. One young woman in a Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform had no coat at all. It had been lost somewhere in the collapse of her unit. An American corporal, passing by, paused for a moment. Without a word, he slid his own shelter half a small canvas rectangle from his pack and held it out. She stared at it, not understanding. He mimed holding it over his head like a shawl. "For Z," he said, accent thick. "For you." She took it hesitantly and drew it up over her shoulders. The canvas smelled of dust and cigarettes. None of this changed the basic reality. They were prisoners of a victorious enemy. Their future was uncertain. Some would be held for weeks, others for months. Interrogations awaited, then barbed wire camps, then long days of nothing in particular. But in the quiet acts of that day, water shared, chocolate distributed, eyes turned away to grant privacy, the shape of their fear shifted. Behind these small encounters was a much larger machinery. The American army that rolled into southern Germany in 1945 was not improvising its treatment of prisoners from scratch. It was guided by directives, manuals, and training that reached back to the First World War and to international agreements. Commanders had been reminded, again and again, that German soldiers were to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. That meant food, shelter, medical care, and basic respect. It did not mean comfort. It certainly did not mean freedom, but it meant limits, lines that were not to be crossed. The presence of women among the prisoners added another layer of caution. American officers worried about discipline. They knew that war had worn thin the habits of ordinary life. Men far from home, under strain, could behave badly if not watched. A single incident of abuse could ignite unrest across a camp, create lasting bitterness, and stain a unit's record. So the military police were given clear authority. They were not the friendliest faces in the army, but they were expected to be firm, predictable, and, as far as possible, fair. Their job was to keep prisoners alive, accounted for, and under control until they could be moved to rear areas. Did every American soldier live up to these ideals? No. In the chaos of the last weeks of the war, there were breakdowns, moments when fear and anger overflowed. Not everyone received the treatment they should have, but at that roadside collection point on that day, the system functioned more or less as intended. The women were not special targets. They were simply another group of prisoners falling under a set of rules. For the German women who had expected to be treated as spoils of war, that difference was enormous. As evening approached, the light flattened and cooled. The noise of trucks and shouted orders lessened as other prisoner columns were moved onward. The orchard trees cast long shadows over the ditch. Some of the women, exhausted, finally allowed themselves to lean against one another, heads touching, eyes closed. A few murmured quietly in low voices, trading the barest bits of information. "Do you think they will?" one began. Her companion shook her head, not so much in certainty as in refusal. "We are still here," she said softly. "They have not done anything. We are still here." Down the line, two of the women spoke in low tones about home. One came from Hamburg, another from a village near Munich. Under different circumstances, they might have compared fashions or dances. Now they talked about whether their families were still alive, whether their towns were still standing. A burst of laughter drifted over from the American side of the road, where a small group of GIS had gathered under a tree. One of them had produced a harmonica. The tune he played was thin and a little off-key, but almost jaunty. The women listened, surprised to recognize the melody. A popular American song from before the war that had once been played in German cafes too, with different words. To them, it was another reminder that the men in the strange uniforms were not devils from propaganda posters. They were young, often barely older than themselves, with favorite songs and tired feet, and families somewhere far away. This did not erase the fact that their armies had destroyed German cities, that their planes had bombed homes and hospitals, that their shells had torn apart German soldiers on distant fields. But it complicated the picture. Fear rarely disappears all at once. It loosens thread by thread. Years later, some of those women would remember that day on the roadside in fragments. the feel of cold earth soaking through their skirts, the way their raised arms had trembled when the Americans first approached, the moment a leather bag changed hands without violence, and a man in a foreign uniform said, "Danke," with a rough but unmistakable sincerity. One would recall the shock of being given chocolate, and how strange it felt to swallow something sweet at a moment when she had been bracing for humiliation. Another would remember an American soldier turning his back so she could step behind a fence and retain a small measure of privacy. They did not forget who they had been when they wore those uniforms. They did not forget what their country had done or the ruin it had brought upon Europe and upon itself. But in that particular memory, the war's end was not a scene of screaming and violation. It was a long, cold day of waiting under guard, caught between terror and an unexpected, confusing restraint. Many of them had entered service believing in a certain image of the enemy, cruel, dishonorable, eager to pay them back for what Germany had done elsewhere. On that roadside in southern Germany, in April 1945, that image did not entirely vanish. The war around them was still brutal. Many had parents or siblings lost to Allied bombs, to battles on every front. Yet their own capture did not unfold as they had been taught to expect. It was not mercy in the sentimental sense. No one embraced them, no one called them innocent. They remained prisoners in a foreign army's custody. They sat behind wire and under watch for a long time afterward. But they had discovered that an enemy could defeat them utterly in the field, could take their weapons, their freedom, and their hopes of victory, and still choose not to cross certain lines. Decades after the war, when memories were no longer things to be hidden in shame, some spoke about that strange mixture of fear and relief, of humiliation and unexpected dignity. For them, the end of the war did not come with a single gunshot or a dramatic surrender in a ruined capital. It came in the quiet of a roadside ditch, in the careful distance of unfamiliar hands, and in the realization that, against everything they had been told, the worst thing they feared had not happened.